Hello, everyone. So today we will be debating that there is no true self. So let's get started. So the concept of I or the self is something that not only accompanies us in our conscious experience of the world, but also a source of heavy debate. Throughout history, the self has been investigated from various angles, including philosophy, science, religion, and art. Today, as we explore the concept of the self through the lens of psychology, we will argue that the fixed true self does not exist. Instead, we argue that the self is a dynamic construction forged by our brains, reflecting a complex interplay of ever-evolving aspects of identity. And we will argue this through a social, developmental, and perceptual framework. Firstly, through the topic of developmental change, Holly will highlight how an individual's constant physical and psychological transformations that occur throughout our lives make it impossible for an enduring, unchanging self to exist. Then Maddie will demonstrate how social influences mold our behavior and our beliefs, leading us to adapt and exhibit different selves in various social settings, cultural contexts, challenging the very existence of a singular true self. And finally, moving to a more abstract discussion, V will therefore illustrate that the concept of a self, a static true self, is a socially constructed idea. Using Daniel Dennett's theory, she will ultimately conclude that the illusion of a static self is false and instead a label which merely reflects a dynamic narrative of ever-changing factors and brain processes. So on to the next slide.
Okay. The physical changes in the body and brain throughout the lifespan challenge the notion that the true self as a self that maintains stability and sameness through time. This is particularly relevant when exploring changes that result from the transition from childhood to adulthood. For example, in Lumba, Albrecht, and Stein's 2009 systematic review, they identified substantial changes in the body composition of adolescents during puberty. This includes increased concentrations of testosterone in males, which increases levels of protein and muscle synthesis, and estrogen in females, which increases body fat percentage. Females also began to display shifts in body proportions through increased fat distribution to the hips and thighs. They also identified increasing calcium content in bones during early adolescence compared to childhood. As such, these physical changes in the body between childhood and adolescence challenge the claim that the self remains the same over time. In addition, the brain also undergoes significant physical changes between childhood and adulthood. Kolb and Gibbs' 2011 systematic review of literature on brain development demonstrated that significant changes in cell and synapse birth, maturation, and death throughout the lifespan resulted in completely different physical brains from birth to adulthood. They also highlighted that external factors such as relationships with peers and parents, use of drugs, and the presence of early stress played a role in how cells and synapses in the brain would develop and change over time. Hence, this suggests that even the brain does not maintain stability and sameness over time. Thus, this supports that there is no true self that physically endures over time.
Okay, so another compelling reason why there is no true self is the pervasive influence of social context. People often modify their behaviours, attitudes, and their overall presentation of themselves depending on the particular social situation they find themselves in. We can observe a shifting of ourselves personally throughout the course of most days. Our behaviours as students in this classroom or employees in workplaces will all differ from how we act at home with family or loved ones. We can even hear this change to the self in the phenomena of adopting a customer service voice, or even through Madonna's iconic switch to an English accent after temporarily residing in London. The fact is simple. We moderate ourselves depending on the environment we are in, and thus there can be no one true self. This kind of adaptation is evidenced in a famous experiment that as psychology students we should all be familiar with, the Stanford Prison Experiment. wherein participants quickly adapted to their randomly allocated roles of guard or prisoner, with the former swiftly switching to exercise an authoritarian and abusive role towards participants who, like them, were just regular people. The fact is, we change and moderate ourselves to perform different roles in different contexts. One person can play the part of stern and authoritarian prison guard, then go home and perform the role of nurturing and kind father, then again go out on the weekend with friends and act as an overindulgent larrikin. There is no singular, constant, and unchanging presentation of the self. Rather, the roles we perform and the ways we behave are responsive to the situations we encounter, forming a kaleidoscope of identities and proving that there is no singular or true self. It is impossible.
Finally, the concept of the true self is not a concrete or established idea. Instead, it is socially constructed and it's reliant on separate, incessantly changing ideas. Personality traits, interests, physical features, behaviors, intellectuality, cultural backgrounds may potentially inform a person's sense of self. However, these features are subject to consistent change. Therefore, a true sense of self is a fleeting idea, comprised of continuously changing features which better reflect a person's environment, upbringing, and culture rather than their true self. In the past, studies have researched the correlation between the true self and well-being. Research conducted by Siegel and Hicks in 2011 proposes the sense of self as a utility to improving people's sense of purpose. According to this perspective, a sense of a true self can provide people with their own unique philosophy, which informs their decision-making. Thus, rather than an inherent or innate idea, the true self may be the result of a human tendency or compulsion, which assists in decision-making, motivating one's goals, and facilitating the idea of oneself as a united whole. Daniel Dennett coined the concept the self as center gravity narrative, which challenges the traditional perception of a unified self. The idea of the true self is really the act of applying a semantic title to a concept which does not empirically exist. Therefore, a sense of self can be considered the imposition of a holistic label to otherwise non-related aspects of the self. The concepts which constitute the true sense of self are subject to bias and change in accordance to momentary emotions and the concurrent environment. Therefore, the concept of the true self is more likely a construct which gives people a sense of continuity, purpose, and identity as opposed to a genuine concept.
In conclusion, the arguments presented by Maddie, Holly, and V demonstrate that ultimately there exists no static, enduring self. Beginning from the tangible exploration of Holly's discussion of the developmental changes, supported by research such as Lumba Albrecht and Stein's work on physical transformations during puberty and Kolb and Gibbs' insight into brain development, it emphasizes the malleability of the self throughout the lifespan. And these physical changes challenge the notion of a consistent, enduring self, which is reinforced by the framework of social influence, which demonstrates the dynamic nature of human behavior and how we adapt our personalities in various social contexts, which aligns with the findings of psychological studies like the Stanford Prison Experiment, which reveals that the self correlates to roles and our capacity to switch within these roles in response to external factors. And then finally moving to V's more abstract examination of the subjective nature of the self, she ultimately concludes that it's a socially constructed idea. Using Daniel Dennett's theory, she ultimately concludes that the illusion of the static self is a false narrative and a label which we reflect dynamic narratives of ever-changing factors and brain processes, giving people meaning and a philosophy to live by. Taken together, these arguments rooted in psychological research, they all converge to support the idea that the notion of a true self, in essence, is an illusion, and our identity is a fluid and ever-evolving construct shaped by social constructs, developmental changes, and subjective perceptions. Therefore, there is no enduring true self, but rather a dynamic interplay of the following factors, which gives us a sense of continuity, purpose, and identity in our ever-changing lives.